In a victory for the Second Amendment, a group called the Gun Owners of America, they've just defeated a gun control provision that was hidden deep within the pages of the latest military funding bill. Because you see, the way that Congress has evolved over time is that if you are a politician and you have a law which is just too controversial to pass on its own, meaning that the American people wouldn't go along with it, what the politicians have learned to do is to essentially sneak that law in through the back door. They take the provisions of whatever unpopular law they're trying to pass, and they hide those provisions within the text of another bill that has to pass, which is why these bills going through Congress now wind up being as thick as several phone books stacked on top of each other. Now, one of these bills that absolutely is a must pass is the annual National Defense Authorization Act, otherwise known as the NDAA. This is the bill that Congress passes every single year in order to authorize America's defense budget for the following fiscal year. Hardly anyone in Congress would block that type of a bill, especially given what's happening in the world right now. However, just like clockwork, anti-gun politicians have attempted to sneak in some secret legislation into this year's military spending bill. Specifically, they were trying to sneak in a permanent reauthorization of the Undetectable Firearms Act, otherwise known as UFA. And when I say sneak in, I really do mean sneak in, because if you went through the pages of the bill, you'll find that hidden somewhere between a part about the veterans' housing budget and a plan to rebuild a hospital over in Puerto Rico, there was a single paragraph which said the following, quote, Section 2F of the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 is amended, 1. By striking effective date and sunset provision and all that follows through this act and amendments, and inserting the following, effective date, this act and the amendments, and secondly, by striking paragraph number 2. Now, in and of itself, that one little paragraph looks just like harmless legal jargon on a page. However, in order to fully understand how this one little paragraph that was snuck into the defense bill further erodes our Second Amendment, well, we need to quickly go through what the Undetectable Firearms Act actually is and why striking out the effective date in this law puts our rights in jeopardy. Now, in case you don't know, the UFA, the Undetectable Firearms Act, was first proposed back in the 1980s, when polymer-based guns like the Glock 17 were first beginning to enter the market at scale. Quote, the Undetectable Firearms Act began as an attempt to ban handguns like the Glock 17 when they were first introduced to the market in the mid-80s. At this time, polymer-framed handguns were a very new idea, and a misunderstanding about the Glock's polymer frame prompted an idea that even though the Glock had a metal slide, its polymer frame would somehow make it undetectable to a metal detector and therefore be the weapon of choice for criminals. And after much debate, the UFA, the Undetectable Firearms Act, was eventually passed by Congress and signed into law in 1988 by President Reagan. And essentially, this law made it illegal to do two things. Firstly, it made it illegal to manufacture, sell, own, or transfer any gun that did not possess at least 3.7 ounces of steel. And then secondly, this law made it a requirement that all handguns must be manufactured in the shape of a traditional handgun. Now, of course, the law had exceptions for the federal government and for federal agencies, but for the common American citizen like you and I, well, these were the two main things that this particular law achieved. However, it came with a 10-year-long sunset clause, meaning that the law was only supposed to be on the books for 10 years. But in 1988, it was renewed for another 5 years. In 2003, it was renewed for another 10 years. And then in 2013, it was again renewed for another 10 years. Which brings us neatly along to this year, 2023, where politicians are attempting to reauthorize this bill permanently by sneaking this language into this year's military spending bill. However, this plan of theirs, well, it was discovered by an organization called the Gun Owners of America, who described themselves as being the only no-compromise gun lobby here in the country. And if their name sounds familiar to you, that might be because this was the organization behind the recent Supreme Court decision which struck down the state of New York's restrictions on concealed carry permits. That was, of course, the famous Bruin decision, which essentially upended restrictive gun laws across the whole country. And this organization, they caught Senate leadership sneaking this provision into the National Defense Bill. Here's what they wrote over on Twitter back in July. Quote, Senate leadership has agreed to sneak the Reid Amendment 636 into the National Defense Authorization Act to reauthorize the Undetectable Firearms Act forever. The swamp is afraid to take a clean vote for or against this gun control, so they skipped committee and hid it in a substitute amendment. They then urged people to contact their own senator to ask them to oppose the reauthorization of the UFA, the Undetectable Firearms Act. Their argument was that the Undetectable Firearms Act was stifling manufacturers as well as not really helping public safety anymore given the advances in technology. Quote, nowadays, with the advent of 3D printing, the Undetectable Firearms Act stifles manufacturers from producing smaller, lighter, and higher performing handguns because they must meet the law's weight requirement. This issue is compounded for the consumer handgun market because of the massive demand for for concealed carry firearms, especially in light of the recent landmark U.S. Supreme Court Bruin decision. In addition, security measures have come a long way since the 1980s. Metal detectors are quickly being replaced by AI detection technology and less invasive sensor-based body scanning. The Undetectable Firearms Act nowadays only serves as an arbitrary and capricious gun control statute masquerading as public safety. One of the main cruxes of their argument here is that with the advent of inexpensive 3D printing technology, the reauthorization of this law would essentially stifle the development of 3D printed guns. Here was in fact how this particular argument was laid out in the pages of the Federalist magazine quite well. Quote, "One of the more pressing questions surrounding the government's limitations on 3D printed firearms is whether it actually matters. But in reality, it's the slippery slope that matters most. New firearm technology has been on the horizon since before 1791, when the Second Amendment was ratified. It has been a constant, and 3D printed firearms are no different. Today, anyone can build a single-shot pistol using nothing but a PLA, a 3D printer, and some plans from the internet. But a decade from now, a 3D printed firearm will almost certainly be more advanced. What our congressmen make apparent, and most citizens ignore, is that permanently enacting older legislation will result in dire future consequences. 3D printers were once a faraway technology that some only dreamed about. What's on the horizon now is more effective and sustainable firearms. Future technology is now banned before it can even come to fruition." However, it actually didn't come to that, because the Gun Owners of America, they released a statement just 3 days ago, this one right here, saying that this provision had actually been removed. Quote, "Over these past 40 years, much has changed. More and more gun owners are starting to embrace the no-compromise mindset. As such, renewals of bills like the Undetectable Firearms Act will be harder and harder to pass. Because of the work of grassroots Gun Owners of America members of Congress are starting to oppose gun control like the Undetectable Firearms Act, removing it from the must-pass bills like the National Defense Authorization Act. While gun owners should enjoy the victory, we must remain vigilant until the Undetectable Firearms Act is laid to rest permanently." And indeed, if you go online and look at the latest version of the military spending bill, the paragraph regarding the permanent reauthorization of the UFA, the Undetectable Firearms Act, is no longer there, meaning that at least for the time being, the UFA has not been renewed. And barring any future action, it will sunset this year, given the fact that it is 2023. And actually, I'd love to know your thoughts regarding this matter. Do you think that the Undetectable Firearms Act is indeed a violation of our Second Amendment rights and should therefore just be done away with? Or do you think that forcing manufacturers to include a certain percentage of steel in their design in order to make the gun detectable by metal detectors is a good compromise between freedom and safety? Or do you think with the advent of 3D printing technology, it's not even relevant anymore? And furthermore, what do you make of the way that this law was about to be reauthorized? Because I can imagine that out of 100 senators in the chamber, only a tiny portion of them would actually read through the entire 2,300-page document. And even if they did read through it, how many senators would catch that one little paragraph which removed the sunset clause from the Undetectable Firearms Act? Probably, literally, none.
Come to Turning Point Faith's Believer Summit. July is hot in Florida, so you need to stay hydrated. Our official water partner, Freedom 2.0, has you covered. We drink Freedom 2.0 at all Turning Point events and tour stops. Freedom Water is reverse osmosis UV filtration water, and they're standing up for free speech with every sip. Use code CHARLIE for 15% off your order of Freedom 2.0 water and be entered to win an all-expense-paid trip to America Fest in December. Freedom 2.0 is plastic neutral, and the bottles used at our events will be made into bracelets that will be handed out at AmFest this December. Go to freedom20.com to order yours, and don't forget to use promo code CHARLIE.
And then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.